And I'm going to introduce Padraig to start us off. No, I would do if I had the right piece of paper up. Apologies, Padraig. Okay, yeah, Padraig and later Tom, co-directors at Self Organised Architecture, which is a not-for-profit action research think tank formed in 2017 to research and promote cooperative and collaborative approaches to housing in Ireland. They study proven and successful European and North American strategies and look at how these might be adapted in Ireland. In 2019, they hosted a series of events on the subject of community-led housing, including an international conference, which drew over 400 people in attendance. Building on the research base generated by this and other activities, throughout 2020 and 21, they coordinated a comprehensive multi-stakeholder study to roadmap a viable community-led housing sector for Ireland. It's an absolutely fantastic piece of work. And the reason we've invited Padraig and Tom along today to talk about that work is to help us. There's a few reasons, and the same goes for bringing Trevor along. Is to help us to get a sense across Wales that we are part of a wider movement. This is a community of people across the world who want to see better approaches to community-led housing. To learn from what they've uncovered in that work, much of which will be relevant in Wales as it is in Ireland and in the Netherlands. Look at some of the barriers and challenges they face in their countries and how we can overcome those, how they've overcome them in their own countries and how we can overcome them here. And yeah, to give you a bit of a sense of where the movement is going internationally, how we can contribute to that in Wales. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Padraig.
Great, thanks a million, Hugh. I'll just share my screen here. Great. Do I need to make that full screen, or can everybody see? It's okay. Yeah. Okay. So hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Padraig Flynn. I'm a director at Self Organised Architecture. Hugh has given us a pretty good introduction there, but I suppose the point we'd like to make, we set up in 2017, we're a group of architects, and I suppose the origin for starting to look into community-led housing was that we felt there was the public debate in Ireland, public discussion on housing was overly focused at that time, and probably still is, on delivery of units, kind of supply, and a kind of priority on housing as an asset. And there wasn't much discussion about the kind of neighborhoods and communities that we wanted to build in, and a kind of vision for the future of housing in Ireland. I might just, yeah. So our mission was to promote the possibilities for participatory and non-speculative housing. And to that end, throughout 2018, 2019, we arranged a large series of public events in Ireland to discuss co-housing, community-led housing, and community land trusts, and to see, to talk to the groups who were trying to develop them in Ireland, to find out the issues they were having, the roadblocks they were facing, and to try and help them along the way, and to propose solutions to those challenges. And that has led to the road mapping publication, which we launched in May this year, and which Hugh mentioned. So Hugh has asked me to give a brief overview of the community-led housing movement across Europe, which we did a significant amount of research into in the last 2 years, and then to give an overview of where we are in Ireland right now. So in terms of projects and countries that we've been looking at. For the road mapping study, which we launched in May, that the primary focus was on these 4 countries. So we've been looking at Belgium, and particularly in terms of the community land trust and the affordability issues they've been having in Brussels, which mirror what's been going on in Dublin and some other cities in Ireland as well for the last 10 to 15 years. So the CLTs in Belgium are primarily focused on people on the lowest income levels. We look at Germany as a Tom, my colleague, is actually lives in Hamburg, and Berlin is the city with the most co-housing projects in the world, and it's kind of a test bed for innovation in all forms of community-led housing. We've been looking at England as a kind of policy environment which mirrors Ireland perhaps most closely, and where a lot of the initiatives might be most easily adaptable to Ireland. And we've also been looking at Switzerland and the way that cooperatives are supported over there. And they have a long history of supporting cooperative development back to the 19th century. Also, and we could add a lot more to these countries, but we've been looking at France, who've adopted Brussels CLT's model and are expanding it, the community land trust model, as a means to delivering affordable housing across France. At the moment, their approach has originated in Lille, but it's spreading across the country. We've looked at Laborda in Spain, which is a grant of use cooperative in Barcelona. Barcelona, despite a big history of cooperatives generally, doesn't have a big history of housing cooperatives. And Laborda has, on a lease site from Barcelona City Council, has managed to bring in finance to develop the tallest timber building in Spain, and one of the most innovative projects we've come across. Their model is now being trialed in cities across Spain as well. We've looked at Denmark to a certain extent as the birthplace of co-housing. We visited Copenhagen quite recently, actually, and we've seen that there's a particular focus on co-housing for older people there at the moment, and offering more independence and stronger community for later life. And then we've also, we're keeping a close eye on Scotland, and in particular the Mid-Steeple Quarter Community Land Trust project in Dumfries. So just without going into what's happening in all of those countries, we just wanted to reference Germany as maybe a contrast, an interesting contrast and policy approach compared to England. I'm
sorry, Padraig, to cut across you.
Yeah.
Your slides are stuck on the first one.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So if you
share.
maybe come out of the full screen mode.
Yeah. Can you see those now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Cheers.
Just not sure if I can go back to move through in this mode, but so for Germany, Germany's possibly the country we've been most inspired by, because of the wide range of projects that are taking place over there. A lot of people in Germany would say that they in turn are inspired by Switzerland and what has been happening there. But in contrast, maybe, or as a comparison with what's been happening in England in terms of community-led housing hubs to support groups, grants from national grants and also local grants, and some land management policy in terms of things like the Small Sites, Small Builders program in London. What we've seen in Germany is more of a kind of environment that supports community-led housing across the board, and a whole range of other approaches as well. And two elements of that are a sustainable land management policy, which more and more cities and states across Germany are employing to create sustainable housing at scale. So in Berlin, for example, the state has insisted that all state land must be leased in future. most of this land is allocated according to a social concept procedure, so fixed price allocation of land, and the projects which make the most interesting and socially sustainable proposal are the ones who win the site then. They have a target of, in Berlin, of 20% of housing to be community led in the future. This is just a quote from the State of Berlin, the land management agency in Berlin, who are looking to support allocation of state-owned land for construction of use of projects aimed at the common good. And they're particularly interested in leasing as a means to take properties and land out of the speculative market. The other, and sorry, I should say Tübingen, Freiburg, Hamburg, Munich are all employing policies like this, and Tübingen in particular has managed to deliver co-housing and community-led housing at a very large scale. The other interesting thing we've seen in Germany is affordable finance for sustainable development in general, and this facilitates a wide range of approaches. So as distinct from maybe individual grants for community-led housing, which can often be dependent on a particular political regime or political policy that can be cyclical. In Germany, they have low interest development finance across the board for sustainable projects. And this is facilitating a wide range of approaches. It's administered by ethical private banks locally. And there's also a subsidizing of cooperatives across Germany as well. But the low interest finance is coming from the State Investment Bank, whose priority is to promote construction and to promote environmentally sustainable development. So this project here is a Spreefeld, which is one of the projects in Berlin, one of the most ambitious projects we've seen, where there's cross-subsidization, really mixed income residents, and the financial model was supported by low interest loans from the KfW in Germany. So this is just a quote from Dorothy Ruger at the GLS Bank in Berlin, who says that they've in 10 years never had a co-housing project default, and they've found the groups there to be extremely stable, and they take the time to become experts in their field. So that's just a response to us, because the banks, I suppose, in Ireland are very cautious about innovative approaches. And her view in Berlin, at least, is that co-housing groups have been extremely reliable and sustainable as a financing prospect. So just to mention the SHIC network as well, in terms of a movement across Europe. SHIC is Sustainable Housing for Inclusive and Cohesive Cities, and they're looking to develop supportive infrastructure for community land trusts across the Northwest European region. SOA, as of last year, are the Irish partner in the network. There's 7 countries and 8 partners in it, and just last year, Ireland, Scotland, Netherlands, and Germany joined the network. That's their goals, and there's a huge amount of support and useful information for anyone who's looking to form a CLT on those 2 links. So one is the SHIC network, and the other is our own SOA website, where we've linked to a lot of resources for community land trust. And I suppose one thing to mention about what that network is doing is the French partner in Paris is working on developing a financial model which investors across the region can invest in, and will be an attractive prospect for them to invest in CLTs across country. So that's still a work in progress, but it's something that would offer potentially much more stable source of finance in the longer term. We're also sharing experiences and promoting projects across the region. So just to reference Ireland in particular, we've just completed in May, as I mentioned, the road mapping community-led housing project. This photo here is from Clapjordan Eco Village in Tipperary in Ireland. This is probably the best example of community-led housing in Ireland at present. This was completed, although there's still a lot of vacant land and it's still to be completed, but the latest development was completed not too far after the crash in 2008. It's an eco-village which joined onto an existing village and has actually brought a lot of life to that town. It's very much focused on sustainable building techniques, but one challenge or one area where they would like to improve and would like to maybe move closer to community-led housing model that we're exploring in mainland Europe is that it's not really an affordable approach for people in Ireland. It's a home ownership model. It's based on buying a site and then building your own home. And for a large proportion of people in Ireland, that wouldn't be affordable at present. So just, I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits that we see community-led housing having in Ireland, particularly from a policymaker's perspective. But before getting into any detail on that, I really like this quote from Frank Maloney at Cork City Council. It's from 1982, and it's probably around the time Ireland maybe lost its way a little bit in terms of community-led housing, because until that point there had been a lot of resident-led cooperative development. But he emphasizes that it's for the betterment of the human aspect, that all other aspects of housing should be made to conform. So while community-led housing is addressing affordability and the environment and a whole range of other issues, it's really what we're talking about when we talk about community-led housing is a better quality of life and better neighborhoods for the people who live there. So these are some of the specific challenges we see community-led housing addressing in Ireland. We have a long history of policies which create affordable homes at initial purchase, but that affordability is typically lost once the first owner goes to sell. So we see community-led housing as a means of creating homes which are affordable in perpetuity. We see a lot of potential. Ireland, like many Western European countries, has an aging population, and we are looking for new models of housing which can accommodate older people and kind of combat social isolation and loneliness. Participative urban development, there's a huge amount of objection and challenges to development in Dublin particularly, but across Ireland at the moment, people aren't being involved in the planning process, and a lot of what's being planned isn't reflective of what people need. So community-led housing offers a participative approach. We've a huge issue with dereliction and vacancy in Irish towns at the moment. So we see community-led housing and community land trusts in particular as a civic partnership model, which can combat that challenge. And then the other main areas is resilient and sustainable communities, and that's been particularly evident during COVID, that a lot of the co-housing projects in particular that we've spoken to have proven to be particularly resilient during that time. Community-led housing projects are often also a test bed for innovation in environmentally sustainable living. So just to talk about the roadmap very briefly and why we needed one. Most housing developments is a bit like a jigsaw. There's a lot of elements to put together, and there's a lot of those pieces missing for community-led housing groups in particular in Ireland at the moment. So we've explored these areas, particularly policy, finance, technical support and land, and how policy can support groups in these areas. There's a range of roadblocks. There hasn't been any community-led housing infrastructure in Ireland to date, and there's a range of roadblocks that groups who are trying to initiate projects are facing, primarily lack of recognition and definition, no transparent process to access land, an absence of affordable housing or affordable finance for community-led housing initiatives, and a lack of support in local authorities and at government level technical support for groups that we're seeing in other countries. This is just a brief overview of the the 8 projects who featured in our road mapping research. One of them will be the first mutual home ownership society in Ireland. One is Ireland's first community land trust, the Irish Regenerative Land Trust. There's a co-housing project at Jordan Eco Village, which prioritizes climate sustainable development, but also affordability in a neighborhood that isn't very affordable at present. And there's the Inclusive Neighborhoods project in Kilkenny, which is working with people with support and disability needs. These are the stakeholders who contributed to the project. We've brought people together from the banking sector, the local governments, national government, international advice, a whole range of areas to contribute to this roadmap series. And the output has been a suite of 5 publications, which address different aspects of community housing in Ireland. We have 3 master roadmaps, which map the steps for groups to develop a cooperative co-housing, owner-occupied co-housing, and a community land trust project. And we've also highlighted the roadblocks that still remain in each of these steps. We have a policy roadmap specifically aimed at state agencies and policymakers that outlines measures that they can support groups with, both in the short term and also a longer term strategy to evolve a sector across the country that supports community housing. We have a land transfer roadmap, which looks at a transparent process for allocating public land by lease or sale to groups. And this is a Getting Your Group Ready roadmap, which is specifically for the groups to help them organise themselves through the process. All of this is probably relevant in Wales as well. And then finally, we have a series of financing roadmaps which map out what can be done in the current Irish context to evolve a project. These are the final recommendations that are the headline recommendations that have come from the report. Recognition of community-led housing in statutory and policy documents, capacity building in the form of a hub to support groups across the country, and a community-led housing fund to start a startup fund for projects. A sustainable land management policy, which might involve leasing of public land, and a clear process for assessing demand and responding to need locally. Affordable and accessible finance, I've spoken about that already. And we just see that there's a need to get 2 or 3 pilots over the line to show Irish people what we're talking about. And just finally, just to say the progress that's been made to date, and some of this following the publication. The Irish President endorsed the project by providing a foreword to it, and this support has held a lot of weight. We've had the first acknowledgement in legislation this summer with the newly passed Affordable Housing Act, and they've identified community-led housing and community land trusts as organisations which local authorities can enter into arrangements with. And quite recently, again, we've had Home Building Finance Ireland, who's a state body established to provide finance for small builders. They've now expressed a strong interest in supporting community-led housing groups with construction finance, so long as they've obtained planning permission on a site. And this is just a quote from our president, Michael Lee Higgins, on the potential for community-led housing as a bottom-up example of active citizenship at its best. And actually the last thing I wanted to mention as something that's happening in Ireland right now, we have a mission-driven developer called O'Coolan Co-Housing Alliance, who've been working for the last few years to develop permanently affordable homes, and they're supporting almost every community-led initiative that we're working with as well, and they're working to build those projects with the groups. So thanks a million.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Padraig. That was absolutely fascinating. There is a lot to learn from you guys. I'm really glad you could come along today and talk us through the process that you've gone through. Really, it's really thorough. Obviously, our contexts are slightly different, but there's heaps in what you've done that I think we can learn from and try to apply in Wales. I'm going to rush on. as I'm an atrocious chair and we're already slightly behind, I do apologise, folks. And I'm going to introduce Trevor James. Invited Trevor along to talk about, in contrast to the Irish context where things are developing and they're going through this slower process of bringing expertise together to build a movement for CLH. I invited Trevor along to talk about the Netherlands and the sector there, which is thriving. To talk about what it looks like from the other end, I suppose, and some of the challenges that still exist and how you intend to overcome them in the Netherlands. So, briefly to introduce Trevor, he was working in housing cooperatives in London 40 years ago before moving to the Netherlands. I believe you joined us from Utrecht, Trevor.
Yep.
And he spent the last 4 decades actively supporting community-led housing initiatives as an advisor to citizens groups, housing associations, local authorities, and central government. And since February 2020, he's been the chairman of Co-OpLink, which is a network organisation for cooperative housing. So, a real source of expertise, and we're very, very glad to have you with us, Trevor. Over to you if you'd like to share your presentation.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Okay, right. I'll take you briefly through the situation in the Netherlands and how far we are to date. But I think it's always important looking at international studies to know what the general context is. So in the Netherlands at this time, we have 58% of all dwellings are owned or occupied, 30% of social housing owned by registered social landlords, and 11% is private rental. We have a tradition of community-led housing initiatives with the 2 main drivers being eco-neighborhoods and co-housing. Co-housing we call centraal wonen in the Netherlands, and that has been from the 70s and 80s and 90s of the last century. Were a lot of initiatives, and most of them have been realized in combination with the registered social landlords. A number of years ago, we had some fairly draconic regulations on social landlords, which mean they no longer play a major role. That has partly to do with restrictions on who they may house, but also the fact that they're taxed. So in effect, every 2 months of every year's rent goes to the government in tax, which means that they haven't got much room to invest in anything but hardcore, their main core social housing. Since 2010, we've seen a growing number of new initiatives. Co-OpLink is trying to get an overview at this moment, and we're up to 1,300 and counting. We're expecting will be a lot more. There's a new Housing Act in 2015, which made a form of housing cooperative possible. The form that's in the Act isn't actually a very viable form, but it has led to the government financing experiment programs since 2015. So we've had a number of pilots, a lot of research, and also lots of publications which help groups to form a community-led initiative. Co-OpLink, as Hugh said, is a national organization. We're an association. We work for and with local initiatives. We've partly financed by government in 20 and 21, and we've at the moment the Netherlands hasn't got a coalition government. We're in the middle of forming one. The elections were in March, but the civil servants have promised us that at least for next year we will get the same level of financing. The Co-OpLink was founded in 2019, operational since the beginning of last year. We've got 120 plus affiliated initiatives, 36 of which are members. And our main role is supporting community-led initiatives through sharing knowledge and experience, providing information on legal structures, legislation, finance, and the workings of community initiatives. And we do that primarily by organizing every 3 weeks a Zoom seminar on a particular topic. So, for example, our last Zoom seminar on financing for community-led housing had more than 120 people took part, and on average, anywhere between 50 and 120 people take part. And that's usually that usually means that we're at least 2/3 of that number will be individual initiatives who are looking for information. We have a regular news brief, a newsletter, which means that we keep people in touch and we create interest in the media. We also try to get an overview of articles in papers and television programs and that sort of thing, which provide some sort of focus on community-led initiatives. We do quite a lot of reputational lobbying at local level, at provincial level, and at the level of central government. And we try and provide answers to questions that initiatives ask us, and to put them in touch with local professional support. What we haven't got is enough finance to actually have our own team of advisors who can work locally. The drivers for new community-led housing in the Netherlands are climate change. Quite a lot of groups have high ambitions when it goes to carbon dioxide neutral or even positive, ecologically sound and climate adaptive. The illustration here is Eco door Boekel. That is an initiative with 36 houses. They've got affordable rents, which is a maximum of 700 euros per month. They've won an award as the most innovative building project in the Netherlands in terms of climate and the ecology. And in this scheme, for example, they have what they call a battery, which is filled with slag from the steel production. This is heated during the summer months or the months when the sun's shining by solar panels, and in the winter it's their source of heating. A very interesting project, both in terms of climate change, but also in terms of the fact that it's community-led. And as I said, they're doing better than the building industry by winning the innovation awards. Another driver is for community-led housing is just the fact of community, caring for each other and the surroundings, combating social isolation and loneliness. And we say here, we see the initiatives that have been going for a number of years, that there is people have less need to access traditional healthcare. It doesn't mean that you have to help your neighbor have a shower or anything like that, but it does mean because people are looking after each other, looking out for each other, there's less social isolation, there's more people can within the community can play a positive role in the lives of their fellow members. And a very important one at this time, our housing market is gone completely haywire. House prices are going through the roof. People getting gazumped because they offer the asking price, and it turns out that they should have offered about 10 to 20% more. The price has risen the last year by about 25%. And there's a huge shortage, although we've got 30% social housing, there's a shortage of social housing. So for a lot of groups, it's creating affordable housing, primarily for rental, not only for the first people, but also for the future. So we're looking at sustainable affordability as an important driver for new community-led housing in the Netherlands. We see a number of obstacles. The biggest one is finding locations or finding an existing building you can convert. Very few local authorities own land, and if they do, they have to be prepared to take a lower price than they would get if they were selling it to developers. We do argue that since the housing cooperatives, the community-led housing initiatives, provide long-term affordability, then they should be given a lower price. And certainly, if a local authority has land which they either provide in terms of leasehold or a community land trust, it's possible to build into the leasehold restrictions so that the affordability is guaranteed. But locations is a really big problem here. The other is financing. Dutch banks see housing cooperatives as a business, which means higher interest rates and only 70% in the finance. And groups generally have difficulty in raising the other 30%. Harking back to the presentation, the earlier presentation, the first housing cooperatives in the new era here were actually financed by the German GLS Bank, because the GLS Bank knows what a cooperative is. They know they're not high risk, and that has made financing for them there's not a problem. But of course, we live in the Netherlands, and Dutch politicians and Dutch banks don't really like the idea that it's a German bank that's been financing some of the first initiatives. We see a really positive impact of community-led housing and housing cooperatives. If we look at the existing schemes, then we can say they combat isolation and loneliness. They reduce the need for healthcare, as I just mentioned. They have a positive influence on the livability of the surrounding neighbourhood. It's not only their own scheme, but what's happening in the neighbourhood around them is positive. And they maintain affordable housing even better than registered social landlords do. And that in general, they have higher ambitions on climate change, higher ambitions on climate change than registered social landlords and developers. This illustration here is dyfu'r. This is a new build housing cooperative in Amsterdam. Again, coincidentally, it's 36 dwellings, but this one is a mix of studios, smaller dwellings for starters, and family homes, grouped in 5 groups with communal facilities in the whole complex, including workspaces, a living room, studio for yoga and sport, a music studio, a garden and a roof garden. And it's circular. The building is circular. It's a wooden construction, and it's climate adaptive. This is one of the most ambitious climate-related schemes in the Netherlands. So once again, an example of how community-led initiatives can not only be providing affordable housing, but also providing leading the way in terms of climate adaptability. I said we've got quite a few problems, but I must say that we've also got some very positive developments. Dutch banks with the Dutch Rabobank, which is a cooperative bank, are now developing new financial products for housing cooperatives. The City of Amsterdam has an action program aimed at having 10% of all dwellings being owned by housing cooperatives in 2045. It means they are providing locations. They're also providing finance and professional support. And one of the things they've done is that they've created a revolving fund so that if a community-led initiative can get 70% of their finance from a bank, they can get another 25% of their finance from the revolving fund, plus money to pay for professional support in the early stages, which means that the initiative itself only needs to provide 5%. But a lot of the initiatives can do that by crowdfunding. Following on, and what we're now seeing is that other local authorities like Utrecht, where I live, but also Rotterdam, are now considering adopting similar policies to facilitate community-led housing. as a spin-off of the Amsterdam revolving fund, there's an organisation here which supports local authorities in terms of their investments in housing, and they are now willing to roll out a national revolving fund for housing cooperatives on the same basis as Amsterdam. We see community-led housing initiatives are not the only forms of citizen-led initiatives. So we're looking at cooperatives providing healthcare. We're looking at cooperatives in terms of sustainable energy, such as wind and solar. We're looking at cooperatives buying up supermarkets to make sure that supermarkets don't disappear out of small communities. We're looking at cooperatives and community-led initiatives to maintain meeting rooms and pubs in small communities. And Co-OpLink was involved in discussion with senior civil servants from 5 different ministries here who are advising the new government that they should create more possibilities for all types of community-led initiatives. So that's hope that's a good enough overview of what's happening here.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Trevor. That was brilliant and really useful. As I say, a really useful insight into what's going on in a country. There's a lot of contextual similarities to Wales, aging population, overheated housing market, that sort of thing. Key differences, of course. But yeah, thank you. That was really useful insight. I'm going to hurry us along and introduce the minister at this point, as I know she's on a tighter timescale than the rest of us. So I'm sure the minister doesn't need a great deal of introduction from me. Julie James, MS, responsible for climate change brief in Wales, which includes housing. Has a strong history of progressive housing policy, certainly in my work on homelessness prior to coming to this job. The minister was a real champion for progressive policies. Under this current Welsh government, there's a commitment in the programme for government to supporting with community-led housing, and we've invited the minister along today to talk about her vision for how we might achieve that over the next few years. So over to you, Minister.
Thanks very much, Hugh. I'm really delighted to be here. It's really nice to hear at least some of the presentations. As you say, normally I don't get the chance to listen to anybody else. I just get wheeled in and out. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to hear at least some of the contributions this morning. I'm really pleased to be able to come and join you today. I'm really sorry I'll be rushing off at the end of this, but you know, I'm delighted to have managed to get here at all. So a lot of you, as you've just said, Hugh, will have heard me talk before about my continued support for community-led housing. Back in June, for example, during the Communities Creating Homes online network, I had the real pleasure of being at that and at the very first community-led housing festival this time last year. So we've been through quite a lot since then, and we're still in, unfortunately, very uncertain times. And I think, you know, we can all agree that as a nation, we faced one of the most challenging times we've ever faced since last March. And our recent experience have highlighted all the risks and challenges associated with delays and increased costs of building materials, with Brexit, which has lengthened our supply line for a number of imported construction materials, and a number of other worldwide price challenges that we're currently working hard to try and mitigate. But as everybody has said so far, the pandemic brought into sharp focus the fundamental importance of a home, the need for good quality housing, and the positive impacts that has. And that's never been so obvious to all of us. As you just said, social housing has been my absolute top priority since I first became responsible for housing back in December 2018. And it continues to be absolutely front and centre of the priorities for this government. And I cannot stress enough how crucial it is that our focus on building enough social housing remains front and centre. So in this new government, we've got a challenging commitment to deliver 20,000 new low carbon homes to rent within the social centre during the government term. But we know that building homes takes time, and there's a need for housing right now across Wales. Our housing need estimates show that under central estimates, around 7,400 additional homes are needed for the next 5 years. And that includes 3,500 additional affordable homes every year. So the target is challenging, goes just beyond that, and I think that's absolutely where we should be. And just to be really clear, the target is not about market housing. What we want is sustainable communities, and to ensure that, we've got to have communities that are genuinely mixed tenure. So there is a continued need for market housing in Wales, but our target focuses on social and intermediate homes, and it only includes homes rented out by social landlords, social homes for rent, intermediate homes for rent, and shared ownership schemes. We also commit to a focus on low carbon homes through the target. On the 17th of August, I launched the Welsh Development Quality Requirements 2021, Creating Beautiful Homes and Places, or the WDQR 21 as it's known, and it sets out a bold new standard for affordable homes funded by the Welsh Government. The new standard significantly improves energy efficiency in all homes and reduces carbon emissions by requiring higher fabric standards and moving away from the use of fossil fuels for heating and hot water. Further decarbonisation of the electricity grid and the use of on-site renewable energy with energy storage and intelligent controls, we believe will lead to the net zero carbon homes we're all aiming for. In addition to raising standards in relation to sustainability, the WDQR 21 sets out the Welsh Government's quality requirements for housing, which aim to improve the health and well-being of the people who live in the homes. The importance of space and flexibility within and outside the house is emphasised, and it includes the need to consider space for working and learning from home. So I'm sure these changes in the new design standards will be welcomed by all of you in the community-led housing field. Community-led housing is absolutely part of the housing solution in Wales. A core principle of cooperative housing is to enable people to take more control of how their housing is delivered and managed, and I am absolutely committed to supporting that in Wales. We've been delivering direct support for community-led housing sector in Wales since 2012, and our programme for government, which was published back in June, contains the commitment that Hugh just mentioned, reaffirming our support for cooperative housing, community-led initiatives and community land trusts, and it's a commitment I know that the whole Senedd shares. So we also know the process for a community-led group to grow and evolve takes time and significant support, and I want to see this translate into the delivery of homes each community-led group wants and needs. The community-led housing sector in Wales has not grown as we'd like. A number of people have mentioned barriers elsewhere. We know that the sector here has to be driven from the bottom up, but it also needs support from the government, local authorities and wider partners. So I am encouraging all registered social landlords and local authorities to engage with the community-led housing sector to help meet some of the needs. I'm pleased that over 50 community groups are currently engaged with communities creating homes, and I'm also really pleased we've continued our support for the programme this year alongside the Nationwide Foundation. My officials and the Wales Cooperative Centre have held very early discussions about what is needed for a future programme of support as well. We already have good examples of community-led housing in Wales. We want to build on those examples and share lessons learned to support other community-led groups in their establishment. I heard a little bit from Padraig and Tom about the community-led housing roadmap they've developed. The roadmap looks really great. It supports the organisation of financing of groups in Ireland. We are really keen to see something similar and unlock the full potential of Welsh community-led housing in Wales, with cooperative principles as a priority and the focus on embedding those core principles. So I want to hear more from you all about the barriers community-led groups are facing at the moment and what we as a government can do to remove the barriers. We've always been clear that there's financial support for further development of community-led housing with an RSL partner through the social housing grant. I know that's not ideal. In the past, we have supported some cooperatives that have not been successful, and I'm afraid we've got an amount of risk aversion into the system as a result of that. Having the RSL partner secures that public investment is protected, and it maintains the properties for social housing if the cooperative fails. So there are many wider benefits for social housing tenants that go beyond the good quality safety homes, and we know that they can positively impact on health, mental health and education. In the chat, I saw that there are people asking about solutions for high levels of second home. So we know that the community-led housing in rural communities really give us potential opportunities for areas with high levels of second home. The Self Builds Wales scheme and the Rural Housing Enabler programmes both provide real opportunities to overcome some of the barriers facing community-led housing groups and some of the issues our most rural communities are experiencing. But I welcome your thoughts and feedback on how community-led housing can rise the challenge of being part of our housing solution here in Wales, and how you can help us deliver against our challenging housing target. I'll just close for you by welcoming the focus of the festival on the future of community-led housing in Wales. You absolutely do not need to tell me about the positive impacts of community-led housing. I absolutely am persuaded. I'm certainly on your side. We absolutely saw that through the pandemic, where the advantages were very clear. Greater practical support, reduced isolation and loneliness, much more community cohesion, all of the things we want for our housing in Wales. So we absolutely can and must do more to support the growth of the sector in Wales. And I'm really looking forward to the feedback from this festival and the groups around Wales for what we can do to support you into the future. Diolch, thank you.
Superb. Thank you very much, Minister. Great to hear such a resounding endorsement for the sector, as well as acknowledgement of the challenges we face, and a frank view on the need for us to develop partnerships with RSLs. So, Minister, I know you've got to shoot off pretty soon. We've got any questions? I've seen one or two coming in. I think Dave will come to you a question about working with international partners in the rest of the UK shortly. I think that's something we can talk about as a wider panel. Anybody got questions specifically for the Minister? Tracy.
It's about land, basically, land availability, and having some sort of commitment from Welsh Government to start afresh. So much land is governed by LTPs, that if we could take a fresh approach on how land is used for housing, that's something I'd like Julie James to consider.
Do you want me to go straight on to the answers, Hugh, or do you want to take a few and then I'll see what I can cover? I'm going to have to go in about 4 minutes, I'm afraid. So
yeah, appreciate that. I mean, why don't we talk briefly or get your thoughts briefly on land and community access to land? There's a point in there from Casey about learning from Scotland's Community Empowerment Act. Any thoughts specifically on land, Minister?
Yeah, so we've been working really hard to get access to land for community land trusts and other cooperative ventures. I've just recently changed the way that the Welsh Government views its own land. So we now no longer sell off our land to the highest bidder for the amount of money that it will bring. We now take into account wider public aims and socio-economic values in that. So you'll know that we've also put a commitment for 50% social housing on all housing enabled land that the Welsh Government owns. I will say that doesn't come with no cost, because the previous high price was feeding directly into paying for our public services. So, all of these things are difficult. It's not like, I could just do that with a magic wand. We're now working on NRW, health authorities and local authorities to get them to have a similar approach. So higher socio-economic value, including housing, cooperative housing and social housing on their land. But again, it comes with a cost, because they use the proceeds from that land to feed social care, education services and so on. So we're in negotiation with them about what the Welsh Government can do to cover off some of the funding gaps that may or may not occur. We're also looking at work with all kinds of other organisations that have quasi-public land, so higher education authorities, FE colleges. I've recently had a really good meeting with the church in Wales about what we can do with some of their land and buildings. So, we are working really hard on this. What I would say is, if you are aware of any piece of land that might be of interest to you, then do get in touch with us and we'll see what we can do to help. I'm particularly interested in infill sites in urban areas, brownfield sites and so on, because we can help with, we have various funds that can help with putting right contaminated land issues and other structural issues on brownfield sites in particular. So I'm really keen to work with you to try and identify that. But as I say, it's not straightforward, because you'll know that public services in Wales are pushed for cash and have been as a result of various funding decisions made at the UK level for some time now. So these things don't come without cost, but we absolutely determined to do it. And I'm absolutely determined that on our exemplar housing sites that the Welsh Government owns, we will have a mix of social housing, community housing, shared equity, shared ownership, co-op housing in its purest form, and so on. And then the last thing I will say, because I will have to shoot off, I'm afraid, Hugh, is that I'm very interested in rolling out some of the One Planet development type things. And if we can get a cooperative model for that, I'd be really happy to talk to people about how we might make that work as well. So we're very keen, obviously, on the low carbon footprint. So so we can, we can work on that. I'm really happy if you want, through the Co-op Centre, to send me on the chat questions that are coming in. I'm really sorry I can't stay and answer them now, but I will certainly undertake through the Co-op Centre to come back to you with as many answers as we can manage to the questions I can see coming in. So really frustrating not to be able to stay with you. I'm really sorry.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Minister, and thank you for the offer. We will take you up on that. We will send through an email, I'm sure, for the questions. So thank you so much for your responses.
And I'm looking forward to the feedback from the festival overall on what the barriers are, and we can work with you to make sure that we can overcome as many of them as we can. So, diolch. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Hwyl.
Diolch yn fawr. Brilliant. Thank you very much to the Minister. And I also noticed your comment, Helen, about working in partnership on sites in Cardiff. Very much appreciated. Thank you very much. We'll certainly take you up on chat about that. Thank you. Cheerio. Okay. So as the Minister said, apologies if we haven't got around to discussing your question or your area of interest with the Minister. We do still have a fabulous panel, Padraig, Tom, and Trevor, to talk about, as well as a lot of really broad expertise in the room, as it were, to talk about developing CLH across Wales and in cooperation with partners in Europe. So for those of you who had specific questions for the Minister, please feel free to email them to us. I'm sure one of my colleagues will hopefully chuck an email in the chat box, and we will make sure that they are submitted along with the feedback from this session. And for the remainder of our time together, we'll focus on broader questions that hopefully we can get some inspiring good conversation with Padraig, Tom, and with Trevor. So with that in mind, I don't know if you maybe we start off with land. It seems to be an area of particular contention here in Wales. Community access to land. I wonder if the panelists would give a view on how they've overcome community access to land in their countries, or how they think they might need to approach the issue. Maybe we'll start with you, Trevor. You mentioned in your slides it's a pretty difficult area still.
It is. If we look at a local authority such as Amsterdam still has a tradition of leasehold. Usually the person who builds a house on the leasehold land buys, in effect, the leasehold in perpetuity, but it's the leasehold is a way of making sure that land is used for a certain purpose. So Amsterdam says housing cooperatives, we want to, as I said, 10%. So we're making land available. Amsterdam's land prices are right through the roof, but they said we'll make it available cheaper. Then you have the discussion that the minister just had, but that money goes into other services. But they say no, we'll make it cheaper, but in the leasehold we will take up restrictions, which mean that the dwellings will have to be affordable in perpetuity. They can't be sold. They have to be in ownership of the housing cooperative, and the members of the cooperative rent. Other local authorities no longer have that leasehold system, mainly because a lot of authorities find it very onerous task to administer. So we're now looking at maybe trying to get a sort of community land trust in place as a way, as sort of acting as sort of an intermediary body that can make sure that the conditions that the local authority imply are adhered to. We're also looking at in more rural areas. For example, in the Netherlands, we've got a ever increasing intensification of agriculture, which means farms are getting bigger, which means smaller farms are being bought up for the land. And we've got loads of farmyards with maybe a house and a few barns, which are now available. And there are groups are saying, well, why can't we turn those into housing? And then we have a planning issue, because the planning says they're only allowed for agriculture. So we're looking at trying to get local authorities and provincial government to change the planning definition for that type of site, and then relating that to specifically to co-housing or community-led housing initiatives. And we've got, briefly, there was a mention of a developer. We're very wary of developers, but there's one developer here which works for senior housing. They create small schemes with a community facility, and they don't work commercially. What they do is they get groups at local level to lobby their local government to get land, and then they bring in their expertise to actually develop. But then the rents are affordable rents, and if they have a combination of rental and owner occupied, then the owner occupied properties are sold with conditions which mean that they will remain affordable in the future. And that's one way of sort of joining a professional body with local groups. They've got, in the Netherlands, they've got 23,000 members. They've just, their 11th scheme is now being built. And it's taken them something like 10 years to get this far, but that's one way. And they.
So how does the developer profit in that situation, Trevor? Sorry to cut across you, but it sounds like a really interesting model.
Well, that's it. Everybody says, well, they must be making some money some way, but they're a community-driven developer. There is idealism, and they don't make a loss. The builders do the building work, so there's work, but they're not out to make a profit, and that's a very it doesn't, it's the first one I've ever come across who's very transparent about what things cost. They sell, as I say, the houses they do sell are sold under the market price. They had recently on they've just employed another controller, because they get all the time they're being asked, where's the snake in the grass? What's that catch here? But that is But land is generally a problem. So we're looking at primarily at government to try and make it more possible to get land. But we're also looking at ways that maybe a government says, okay, developer, you've got that land, but we're only going to give you planning permission if you do a part of the scheme is social housing, or part of the scheme is in conjunction with a community-led group.
Brilliant, thank you, and apologies for my cynicism in my question.
No, it's very understandable. I was very cynical myself, but I've been convinced.
I love the sound of it. Padraig, Tom, anything you'd like to chip in on this, either from Ireland or from your work in other European nations?
Maybe if I can just elaborate on something that Padraig was talking about, which is the concept for foreign here, which is the social value concept procedure, which provides a basis for allocating state land. That's a procedure that can be used for non-subsidized development as well as a kind of social and affordable subsidized housing. So in Tübingen, for example, there's a very large scale, or there are several large scale developments that were composed of small parcel allocations of land to individual co-housing groups. It's famous, I'm sure everybody knows about it here, but the concept for foreign, the social value concept, was the basis of allocating land there, and the land was allocated at a fixed price. So a price was just determined, which was supposedly the market price for that particular parcel. And then the co-housing groups bought that. Then for more for cooperatives, for subsidized cooperatives, there's also a procedure for allocating land, but that's typically in a place like Hamburg, that would be on a long-term land lease basis. But in Munich, it's also cooperatives providing affordable homes will buy the land from the local authority at a specific price. So the price is fixed from the beginning. It's about €600, I think, per lived square meter. So there's kind of a couple of established routes there, depending on state aid rules, but the concept is the important thing in Germany anyway, in this area.
I might just add to that as well, Hugh, just on what Trevor was saying about the developer, just to elaborate on the developer I mentioned in Ireland, that's cool, and they're an affordable and approved housing body, so similar to an RSL in Wales, but so with a mandate to deliver social housing, but they have more freedom than a lot of the other approved housing bodies because of the way they're set up, and they're currently operating a home ownership model as well. They are similar to what Trevor said. They're mission driven. They have to make, in order to get finance from the banks, they have to make 5%, and now it's gone to 10% profit just to keep the company running. But beyond that, they're not looking to line their pockets at all. They're almost every community-led housing group that comes to us is also talking to them and getting support from a cool, and in some form they can work as developer, as just a builder, provides technical support and advice as well. So they're really facilitating a lot of approaches. One big challenge they've had, they have a clawback mechanism is the only way they've been able to ensure affordability in even the medium term. The only thing that their banks will allow in Ireland is a 10-year clawback. So if anyone sells their houses in a cooling house, they have to give a proportion of the uplift to the local authority. That's just been in the news quite recently because somebody was able to sell one of their houses for quite a significant, almost twice the original price, I think, after 4 years. So they're very interested in the community land trust as a potential mechanism to stop that stuff happening. And the other thing maybe to say about land in Ireland, I mean, the value for money issue that the minister Julie mentioned comes up with local authorities here as well. But we have a huge, as I mentioned, vacancy and dereliction issue in Ireland, and a need to address brownfield development, and often on small sites that the bigger developers aren't interested in. The government has they have a town centre first policy that they're explaining the details of in the next week or two, which is to reactivate the town centres in smaller towns across Ireland, where there's a lot of upper floor vacancy. And the other thing they're bringing in the next year and a half, I think, is a land tax. So we have a lot of land hoarding going on in Ireland. Speculators who own properties but don't want to do anything with them because the value of the land is constantly rising, and there's been no penalization of that. So now in early 2024, I think it's coming in Ireland, there's going to be a land tax across the board. So if you're every year that you don't do something with your property, you will be taxed, and that you won't be allowed to sell your property until you've paid off the tax. So now there's a clear instrument to push owners of kind of collapsing properties to do something with that land, and community housing might offer an outlet for that.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's something we'd love to see here in Wales. Just down the road from me, there's what was a beautiful pub 6 years ago, demolished and turned into just a scrap of land. Nobody's done anything with it. Nobody submitted plans to do anything with it. They're just sitting on it, watching it go up in value while the community around it suffers. So yeah, certainly something we'd love to see here. And you talked about O'Coolan, and then Trevor, your benevolent developers. I think that seems another gap in our system here. As with the revolving loan fund you talked about, Trevor, I mean, there's a glaring hole in what we have in the structure we have here in Wales. We do have certain advantages. We do have obviously a minister who understands and wants to support what we're doing. We've got the Communities Creating Homes team across the Co-op Centre and the DTA here in Wales to offer that technical support, to bring in consultants, to bring in expertise to support groups. But certainly there are gaps, and hearing about hearing from you guys helps clarify, I suppose, what the solutions to those gaps might be. I've had a couple of messages coming in the chat. I'm just going to check briefly. There's the link, Lydia. There's a link from Padraig to O'Coolan there. So we'll look into that. We'll see if we can make contact with them and bring them along to a network or something to talk to folks in Wales. Trevor, if you'd be so kind as to put in a link in the chat to the property developer you mentioned, maybe we could get them along for the same session.
I've already done that.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliant.
But I'll send you some more details, because the website's in Dutch, so I'll
Google's our friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Joe, you've got a question.
Yes, question for you, Trevor, but please, if the other panelists would like to comment if they've got a view on it. You mentioned about talks with banks now to make more finance available in the Netherlands, which is brilliant. What's the typical finance model in terms of the length of it for a cooperative housing scheme, or with the talks that you're having with those banks? Is it the same as the residential, up to 30 years, or is it looking at 40 plus years in terms of mortgage terms?
Well, we tend not to call it a mortgage, but a loan. But traditionally, the banks in the Netherlands have been looking at a 20-year term with the chance of then refinancing. At the moment, we're in discussion with the Rabobank, which is taking the lead to some extent, and they're looking now at a 30-year term with normally you have to pay off the whole loan within that period. What they're now suggesting is that you won't have to pay off the whole loan within the 30 years, which means that it will be a lot more viable for groups to get the rest of the finance. So we're talking at, and the other thing is that if we're looking at the interest rate, which of course is another aspect, one of the reasons that a lot of groups went to the GLS bank, the German bank, is because they don't see the risk that Dutch banks see. Their loans are about 2%, whereas the Dutch banks were 4%. And what we're hoping in the discussions that we're now having with Dutch banks is that they will tend to reduce their interest rates. They have one problem, or more problems, but one of their problems here is that legislation governing banks mean they have a duty of care, which if they're providing a mortgage for an individual means they've got to make sure the individual is able to pay. They see community-led initiatives where it's in effect a loan to a group rather than to individuals, as being a collection of individuals. And how do they then carry out their duty of care? Then one of the questions they've asked us as Co-OpLink is, would we be willing to take that role on? We see that as, to some extent, in not as our role. So we're looking together with the banks if we can find some way of getting a sort of organization that can do that part, which banks aren't. And then obviously they need to avoid risk, but they're not equipped to judge whether or not a group is sustainable, whether the group's got enough power to carry on. But it's certainly it's changed from being something that they weren't considering to now being in dialogue and now being looking at products too. So we're seeing a lot of progress on that front.
Brilliant, thank you.
Just to add to that, just to say something about how things work in Germany in co-ops here. In Munich, a typical term of commitment would be about 40 years for a co-op, but that's extendable to 60 years. The cooperative then can avail of low interest loans for part of the development cost, at least up to half. And they're about 0.5%. So very low interest. Yeah, but that means then that the actual makeup of the cooperative is prescribed. So you need to have certain percentages of income levels in the cooperative, minimum levels. So there's about 25% who need to be on kind of social housing level or below as a minimum. But the top 20%, at least in Hamburg, is open. So any income level can be at the top. But then each level then has its own prescribed rental or rent amount, what you pay as a tenant. So it's quite prescribed from the state. It's a form of subsidized housing here, so it's quite rigid, really. But then you benefit from very favorable conditions.
So do they not treat housing co-ops as commercial lending then? Interest rates that low, that's kind of, whereas here they would treat it as commercial lending, so it's normally charge higher interest, wouldn't they?
No, it would receive a loan from the state bank. So in Munich or in Hamburg, the state investment bank would loan to them. It's interesting though in Switzerland that housing cooperatives aren't seen as a subsidized model, so there's a much more flexible arrangement there. So up to 30%, I think 30% of people who live in cooperatives in Zurich have to be social rental, but the rest is open. And then they have the Zurich Cantonal Bank will finance cooperatives then, but people need also to bring their own equity, and that's something that's actually also true of the German model. People typically need to bring 20 to 30% of the development costs as own equity there. But there are loans to enable that as well. So also in Switzerland, there are schemes to help people bring their own equity, but it's lower in Zurich. It's about 10%, 5 to 10% own equity contribution in the Swiss cooperative.
That's great, thank you.
Can I ask a question related to that, Tom? Which is, are those houses shared houses, or are they individual family or person units?
In terms of the tenure types,
is it a housing co-op where there's 6 people living together, or is it a housing co-op where there's multiple separate units and different range of families, single people living in them? Yeah,
well, the Zurich model is really experimenting in different areas of typologies. So it supports cluster apartments, so where various people will live together in one apartment, and everything from there to typical nuclear family kind of type apartments there. And the same is true in Germany. The social concept procedure kind of allows for experimentation in that direction as well. So And that's also helping to address the kind of social policy objectives that the city has in terms of looking to promote integration of different types of living, but also types of people, types of income levels and backgrounds and abilities. So yeah, I think in both cases the answer is yes. There's a varied use.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. So unless anyone else has another question, I'd like to get one more in that came up in the chat a bit earlier. Simon raised new local authority tax powers being introduced in Wales in areas which are particularly hit by second homes. And I know there was a little bit of chat about this in the Q&A box or the chat box, but I'd like to bring it out. Obviously in Wales, we're suffering from, in Welsh-speaking communities, particularly on the West Coast, suffering from typical second home problems you see in a lot of areas of natural beauty. I wondered, Tom and Padraig, if you could expand a little bit on the impact of that in Ireland. Is it a Gael talks? I apologise. My mum's Irish. She taught me Dún Duras and Cisius. Shut the door and sit down. That's all I remember.
Well chopped. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, could you talk a little about the impact there of second home ownership and how community-led housing, if at all, is being used to address that? What local authority powers are being introduced to deal with it, and anything we might learn from in Wales?
I know there's been a few groups recently in touch with us from the west of Ireland and Galway in particular, and Tom has spoken to one or two of them, so I might let Tom elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't really any specific measures for that yet. It's really a growing problem. We've had a few groups coming to us from the West in particular, who are finding that local people who actually work in the hospitality industry are being priced out by second homes and also by Airbnbs. So there were three villages in the west of Ireland who are people from villages in the west of Ireland who've got in touch with us there. So we've just helped them do a sort of an outline plan or to make a contribution to the local development plan. But at the moment, there isn't any specific support measures for communities to address this area, like what you have in Wales. So policy is actually in development there. I posted a link there earlier to Simon. I think I asked the question, and I posted a link there to the latest rural development policy in Ireland, which looks like that there might be a lot of potential for communities, but we're also waiting for regulation on community-led housing in Ireland to come into being, and that's going to make a big difference as to what people can do locally. Yeah, so it's in transition, I think.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps we'll get you back in the future, talk about where it's got to. Listen, folks, we've hit our time limit. Thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating session. I always wish the minister could stay longer, and she would have had some good contributions to make to some of these conversations. But please do submit questions to us. I don't know if we've got an email in the chat. I'll chuck my own in there for now. Please do submit any questions that you'd like passed on to the minister. We'll put them all together and we'll get some answers back to you. Kerry, you're not on mute. There we go. Thanks. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up there. Thank you so much, folks, particularly Trevor, Padraig, Tom. Really, really useful to hear your insights and your perspectives from different contexts. Diolch yn fawr pawb for wonderful questions and a great conversation. We will, hopefully we'll stay in touch and see if we can help each other out in the future. Thank you very much.